Jim Chalmers, good to see you. The IMF downgrading its forecast. For Australia, it seemed even worse. What should the government do?
Well, these new IMF numbers really do torpedo what was left of the government's economic credibility. As Eliza just pointed out, the time has long passed for the government to just keep sitting on its hands. The economy is floundering in Australia because the Morrison government doesn't have a plan to turn things around. Right around the world and right around Australia, economic experts, commentators, the mainstream view is that it's time for the government to get off their hands and to do something and to come up with a plan to turn around an economy which is floundering on their watch.
And what plan should that be? Should that be, I mean, if the IMF is downgrading the forecasts, the worst downgrade in 10 years, that takes us back to the global financial crisis. Back then, it was Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan sending cheques to people. Are we at that stage?
Well, the big difference this time around is that the Australian economy is underperforming against the world. And as you rightly pointed out a moment ago, the forecasts for Australia have actually been slashed more substantially than for the rest of the advanced economies, 4 times bigger.
Compared to G7 nations, because that's what the Prime Minister has pointed out today, we're still doing better than most G7 nations, aren't we?
Well, look, the Prime Minister's kidding himself if he thinks that the slowest growth in 10 years in Australia is some kind of good outcome. And this is why Australians think that this guy's from another planet. We've had weak growth, the weakest for 10 years, stagnant wages, declining living standards, almost 2 million people are looking for work or more work, record household debt, and Morrison and Frydenberg want to pretend that everything's hunky-dory in the economy. They don't have a plan to turn things around. I don't think Frydenberg has a clue what he's doing here, and so he's doing nothing.
So what
and that's very damaging for the Australian economy.
Is it emergency stimulus that is required in the form of, you know, cheques, money getting into people's bank accounts ASAP, or can it be done through fast-tracking infrastructure projects, or are we past that point now?
Well, some combination of those things. It's very clear now that the interest rate cuts are helping but not enough. If the tax cuts are helping, they're not helping enough. We can bring forward some of the government's 2022 tax cuts if they want to. We could increase Newstart, which would get money flowing through the economy, bring forward infrastructure projects and maintenance. We could have a tax break for business investment because business investment's the worst it's been since the early 1990s recession. They clearly need a wages policy and don't have one. They clearly need an energy policy and don't have one. Any or all of those things would give Australia to shift the needle, give Australia a chance to shift the needle on economic growth. Instead, the government doesn't have any plan whatsoever, and that's why we've got these downgrades to Australian growth.
Don't these new figures all show you that the plan that Labor took the election is the wrong one for this time?
Well, the economy's deteriorated substantially since the election, and the Liberals and Nationals are now in their 7th year and their 3rd term, and so they need to take responsibility for the fact that the economy is floundering. We will always make our economic policy set the times. The government has not been willing to do that.
So
they don't know what they're doing, and they don't have a plan.
Now would not be the time to impose $300 billion worth of new taxes. Would now be the time to impose things like franking credit changes, changes to the property market?
Well, as you know, we're reviewing all of those controversial policies that we took to the last election.
Does this give you a new impetus, I guess?
Well, obviously, you need to factor in the economic conditions when you're making economic policy. The government's not doing that. That's our main criticism of them, is that they're doing nothing despite the fact that the economy is floundering. It depends what the tax changes are. That's what actually matters. And what we're calling for the government to do is to come up forward with a plan. The economy is floundering. The IMF is torpedoing the government's economic credibility. The Reserve Bank can't be left to do all the heavy lifting on its own.